The sun had just begun to rise over the quiet town, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The streets were mostly empty except for the sound of a few early birds and the occasional car passing by. On the edge of town, away from the noise and rush, stood a small wooden house with a white fence and a wide patch of open land behind it. It wasn't fancy or big, but it was peaceful, and that peace was all the man who lived there ever wanted. Inside the house, the smell of coffee filled the air. The man stood by the kitchen window, a mug in his hand, staring at the morning mist that hovered above the grass. His short hair was sprinkled with gray, and his face carried quiet lines that spoke of years spent under harsh sun and sleepless nights. He wasn't old, but life had aged him faster than time could. Beside him sat a large Belgian Malinois, calm and alert, his deep brown eyes watching his owner's every move. The man glanced down and smiled softly. "Morning, buddy," he said. The dog's ears perked up and his tail gave a small, controlled wag. The man didn't talk much these days, but when he did, it was often to his dog. They shared a bond that went beyond words. Both had seen things few could understand, and both found comfort in the quiet routine they now lived. Every morning was the same. After breakfast, they would head out to the open field behind the house. The man carried a small backpack. Inside it were a few simple items: a ball, a whistle, a short leash, and a folded American flag. He never went anywhere without that flag. It was more than a symbol for him. It was a reminder of the men and women he had once served beside and the missions that still echoed in his memory. The dog trotted beside him as they walked through the dew-covered grass. The air was cool, the ground soft beneath their boots and paws. When they reached the middle of the field, the man stopped and took a deep breath. For a moment he simply listened, to the wind brushing through the trees, to the distant hum of life waking up. Out here the world felt far away. There were no sirens, no shouting, no chaos. "Just peace, all right, Ranger," he said softly. "Let's get to work." The dog stood tall, focused, eyes locked on his handler. With a quick hand signal, the training began. The man threw the ball far across the field and Ranger sprinted after it with incredible speed. The man watched, his mind flickering with memories of a time when that same dog had run across deserts and forests, searching for threats, saving lives. Back then, every move mattered. Every signal meant survival. But here it was different. This was their new mission, to heal. He crouched as Ranger returned, the ball clutched gently in his jaws. The man took it and patted his head. "Good boy," he said in a low, calm tone. Ranger's tail wagged again, just slightly. The man threw the ball again, a little farther this time. They repeated the drill, mixing in short commands, hand gestures, and whistle cues. It wasn't just a game. It was discipline, trust, and understanding. As they trained, the man felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of normalcy. Out here, he wasn't a soldier or a survivor. He was just a man with his dog doing what they loved. Sometimes neighbors would walk by on the trail that bordered the field. They would wave politely and he would nod back. They knew him only as the quiet guy who lived on the edge of town with his well-trained dog. Nobody knew what he had done before, and that was how he liked it. He had moved to this small town 2 years ago after retiring from service. It had taken him months to get used to civilian life. The silence, which once felt comforting, had started to feel strange. The grocery store trips, the small talk with strangers, the slow pace, all of it felt foreign to someone used to danger and urgency. But Ranger had made the transition easier. The dog's steady presence anchored him. When the nightmares came, Ranger would lay his head on his chest until he calmed down. When the days felt too long, Ranger would nudge his leg, reminding him to get outside and move. They were partners, just as they had been on missions halfway across the world. After the morning training, they sat together on the grass. The man took off his gloves and rubbed Ranger's neck gently. "You did good today," he said. Ranger leaned against him, letting out a soft sigh. The man smiled faintly, feeling a warmth that words couldn't describe. Moments like this were what he lived for now. Simple, peaceful, quiet. Sometimes he thought about his old life. The operations no one could talk about. The long nights under foreign skies, the friends who never made it back. There were faces he still remembered clearly. Faces that came back to him when the world was too quiet. He had lost many brothers in arms, but he had also gained something priceless: Ranger. The dog had been assigned to him years ago when both were younger and sharper. Together they had faced danger that tested every bit of courage and instinct they had. Ranger had saved his life more than once. And now, after it all, they were each other's only constant. The man took out the folded flag from his backpack and placed it gently on his lap. He looked at it for a long time, his eyes distant. He didn't display his medals or talk about his missions. He didn't need to. That flag, to him, carried all the meaning he needed. It reminded him of loyalty, duty, and sacrifice, values he still lived by quietly, even now. A light breeze picked up, rustling the grass. The man stood, brushed off his pants, and whistled softly. Ranger jumped up, ready for another round. But instead of drills, the man simply threw the ball one last time, smiling as he watched the dog chase after it with joyful energy. When Ranger returned, panting lightly, the man knelt and gave him a treat from his pocket. "That's enough for today," he said. "Let's head home." Back at the house, the man filled Ranger's water bowl and poured himself another cup of coffee. The two sat on the porch together, the dog resting at his feet. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting warm light across the yard. The man watched a group of kids ride their bikes down the street, laughing and shouting. He smiled faintly at the sound. He liked this town. It was peaceful, friendly. People here minded their own business. It was a good place to start over. The mail truck stopped briefly by his mailbox. The man walked down the path and collected the letters. Mostly bills and ads, but one envelope caught his eye. It was from an old unit buddy. He hadn't heard from anyone in a while. He opened it slowly, reading the short note inside. It wasn't much, just a few words of checking in, a line about how everyone still remembered him, and a simple thank you for his service. He folded it neatly and set it on the table. It reminded him that even though he had left the battlefield, a part of it would always stay with him. Later that afternoon, he took Ranger for a walk around the neighborhood. The townspeople greeted them warmly. Kids waved at Ranger, amazed by his obedience and calmness. "Your dog's amazing," one boy said. The man smiled. "He's a good one," he replied. He didn't mention that the dog had once detected explosives or tracked down dangerous targets. That was a story for another life. Here, Ranger was just a loyal pet, and that was enough. They walked to the park at the end of the street. It was quiet, filled with the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. The man sat on a bench while Ranger sat beside him, ever watchful. He thought about how lucky he was to have this new chapter. He didn't need fame or recognition. He just needed peace, time, and the company of the one soul who had never left his side. When the sun began to dip again, they returned home. The man made a simple dinner, chicken, rice, and some vegetables. Ranger got his meal too, sitting patiently until given the signal to eat. The discipline was second nature to both of them. Afterward, they watched a bit of television. The man didn't like the news much. It reminded him of things he preferred to forget. Instead, he switched to an old movie, something about hope and second chances. He leaned back and Ranger rested his head on his knee. As night fell, the man stepped outside one last time. The stars were out, bright against the dark sky. The sound of crickets filled the air. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool night wind on his face. He thought about how far he'd come, from dangerous missions overseas to this quiet little home where no one knew his past. It felt strange but right. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He was just living. Ranger joined him on the porch, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. The man reached down and patted his head. "You did good today," he whispered again. The dog looked up, eyes calm and loyal. For a while, they sat there in silence, just two souls who had been through hell and found their way back. When he finally went inside, he turned off the lights and checked the locks, an old habit he couldn't shake. He lay down on the bed and Ranger curled up nearby. The house was silent, except for the slow rhythm of breathing. One man, one dog, both resting after another day of peace hard-earned. Sleep didn't come easily anymore, but tonight it came quicker than usual. The man's last thought before drifting off was simple and grateful. He was home. The next morning began like any other day. The man woke up early just as the first light touched the windows. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of breathing from the corner where Ranger slept. For a few seconds, the man just lay there listening. It was a habit he had never lost, to wake slowly, alert, aware of every sound around him. Old habits didn't die easily, but in this calm little town they no longer felt like burdens. They were just part of who he was. He got up, made his bed with precise folds, and brewed his coffee. Ranger stood at the door, tail wagging gently, waiting for the signal to begin their morning routine. "You're ready already, huh?" the man said with a faint smile. Ranger's ears perked up at the familiar tone. The man put on his jacket, took his backpack, and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wet grass. The world was peaceful, at least for now. As they walked toward the field, the man waved at a passing jogger who greeted him with a friendly nod. Most people in town liked him, even if they didn't know much about him. They admired how disciplined his dog was, how polite he always seemed, how he never caused trouble. To them, he was just another neighbor who loved his dog more than anything. And that was exactly how he wanted to be seen. When they reached the open field, the man took a moment to stretch his arms and look around. The sun was slowly climbing over the horizon, lighting up the tall grass. Ranger stood beside him, perfectly still, waiting for the first command. "All right, partner," the man said softly. "Let's do this." The training started as usual, simple drills, nothing too intense. He used clear hand signals, short commands, and a whistle that carried across the quiet space. Ranger moved like a professional, focused, graceful, every action sharp and precise. The man couldn't help but feel proud watching him. He remembered the early days when the dog had been just a pup, all energy and chaos. Training him back then had taken patience, but the result was worth every second. After a few rounds, the man paused to let Ranger rest. He knelt beside him, rubbing his fur. "You still got it, buddy," he said. Ranger panted softly, his eyes full of trust. The man smiled. "We're getting old, but not slow, huh?" The field wasn't completely private, though. Beyond the trees on one side was a small residential area. People sometimes walked their dogs or played with their kids nearby. Most of them were used to seeing the man train his dog and didn't think much of it. They'd stop for a few minutes, admire how obedient the dog was, and move on. But not everyone understood what they were seeing. That morning, as they trained, a woman walking her small dog passed by on the nearby trail. Her dog barked at Ranger, who stayed focused and still, eyes fixed on his handler. But to someone who didn't know the signs of trained behavior, Ranger's stance might have looked intimidating. Muscles tensed, ears forward, attention locked. The woman tugged on her leash, frowning. She muttered something under her breath and walked away quickly, glancing back nervously. The man noticed her reaction and sighed quietly. He didn't take it personally. It wasn't the first time someone had misunderstood. Ranger was large and powerful, and not everyone knew how to read a working dog's body language. He brushed it off and continued the training. A little while later, he finished the session and sat down on a rock near the edge of the field. Ranger sat beside him, head held high, tongue hanging slightly from the side of his mouth. The man opened a bottle of water and took a sip before pouring some into a small collapsible bowl for Ranger. They sat there in the shade for a few minutes, enjoying the quiet. It was then that he heard the distant hum of an approaching vehicle. He didn't think much of it at first. Cars often passed along the road nearby. But this one sounded closer, slower. Then came another sound and voices. The man turned slightly and saw a police car pulling up near the dirt path that led into the field. Two uniformed officers stepped out, looking around. The man stood slowly, confused but calm. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Maybe they were looking for someone. Ranger stayed by his side, alert but not aggressive. The officers started walking toward him, their expressions cautious. "Morning, officers," the man said politely, raising one hand in greeting. "Something I can help you with?" One of the officers nodded, keeping his eyes on Ranger. "Morning. We got a call from a resident nearby," he said. "They reported a large dog acting aggressively out here." The man blinked in surprise. "Aggressively?" He looked down at Ranger, who was sitting calmly beside him, tail still. "He's just been training, sir. We do this every morning. He's obedient and trained. Never hurt anyone." The younger officer shifted slightly, hand resting near his belt. "Mind if we take a closer look? Just to make sure everything's all right?" "Of course," the man said, keeping his tone steady. He'd dealt with law enforcement before. Respect went a long way. "He's fine, but you can come closer if you'd like. Just stay calm and don't reach toward him." The officers hesitated. One of them murmured something to the other, too quiet for the man to hear. He noticed the tension in their posture. It wasn't fear exactly, but unease. Ranger sensed it too. The dog's eyes followed their every move, ears alert, muscles tight but controlled. He wasn't threatening them. He was simply protecting his handler as he had been trained to do. The man gently placed a hand on Ranger's back. "Easy," he said softly. The dog relaxed slightly at the touch. The man turned back to the officers. "He's a retired working dog," he explained. "He's used to following commands. Please don't make sudden moves." The older officer nodded slowly, but the younger one looked uncertain. He probably hadn't seen a dog like Ranger up close before. Maybe he'd only dealt with aggressive pets, not trained service dogs. Misunderstanding hung heavy in the air. The man could sense the situation teetering on a delicate edge. He didn't want trouble. "Listen," he said calmly, raising both hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "He's under control. If you like, I can show you." Before he could finish, the woman who had walked by earlier appeared at the edge of the trail, talking hurriedly into her phone. "That's the dog," she called out. "That's the one. He was growling and charging earlier." The man turned toward her, surprised. "Ma'am," he said, trying to stay calm, "he wasn't charging. We were doing training drills." But his words got lost in the rising confusion. The officers exchanged glances. The younger one took a step back, his nerves clearly rising. Ranger, sensing the sudden shift in tone and body language, stood up, alert again, his gaze fixed on the officer's movements. The man immediately gave a sharp command. "Sit." Ranger obeyed, lowering himself but keeping his eyes locked forward. "Please," the man said, his voice steady but firm. "He's trained to respond to my voice only. He's not a threat. Just let me explain." The older officer nodded slowly. "All right, sir, let's just keep things calm here." He turned to his partner. "Take it easy. No need to rush." The younger officer hesitated but followed the lead. The tension slowly began to ease. The man kept talking, explaining how Ranger had been a service dog, trained for discipline and rescue operations. He spoke gently, showing them the whistle and the ball, explaining the drills they had been doing. The officers listened, their expressions softening as they realized the misunderstanding. After a few minutes, the atmosphere felt lighter. The older officer smiled faintly. "Sounds like he's quite the partner," he said. The man nodded. "He's the best there is." They exchanged a few more polite words. The younger officer apologized for the confusion, admitting they'd just been cautious because of the report. The man understood completely. "You were just doing your job," he said sincerely. "No harm done." When the officers left, the man exhaled deeply. Ranger looked up at him, sensing the change in energy. The man knelt and scratched behind his ear. "It's okay, boy. Just a misunderstanding." But as they walked back home, a lingering unease stayed with him. Not anger, and just sadness. It reminded him how easily things could go wrong when people judged without understanding. Ranger wasn't just a pet. He was a soldier's partner, a hero in his own right. Yet to strangers, he was just a big dog that looked intimidating. The man wished people could see what he saw, the loyalty, the intelligence, the heart. Back home, he made some tea and sat by the window. Ranger lay on the rug near his chair, calm again. The afternoon light streamed in, casting a warm glow on the wooden floor. The man looked at his companion and smiled softly. "You did good today," he said. "You stayed calm, just like you were trained." Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. The man chuckled quietly. "Guess we both passed another test." As evening came, the town lights flickered on in the distance. The day had been more eventful than usual, but the peace of home soon returned. The man cooked dinner, fed Ranger, and sat on the porch again as the sun dipped below the trees. The air was still and cool, the kind of stillness that made you feel safe. He thought about how quickly life could change, how a simple misunderstanding could become something serious if not handled carefully. He was grateful that it hadn't gone that way today. Maybe the officers would remember to think twice next time before assuming the worst. Maybe that woman would realize she had misjudged a loyal dog doing what he was trained to do. Ranger came over and sat beside him, resting his head on the man's leg. The man stroked his fur gently. "You and me, buddy," he said softly. "We'll just keep doing what we do." The stars appeared one by one, and the quiet night wrapped around them like a blanket. Tomorrow would be another day, another sunrise, another chance to train, another chance to live in peace. The man didn't know that this calm would not last forever. But for now it was enough. He took a slow breath. feeling the warmth of Ranger's loyalty beside him, and whispered almost to himself, "We're home, and that's all that matters." The morning was quiet, calm, and bright. Birds chirped in the trees as the sun warmed the dew on the grass. It was one of those days that began with promise, where everything felt steady and peaceful, and the world seemed gentle again. The man sipped his coffee slowly as he looked out from his porch, watching Ranger sit patiently near the steps, alert but relaxed. It had been a few days since the officers came to the field. Things had gone back to normal and life was simple again. The man had brushed off the incident, not letting it linger in his mind. He had learned long ago that some moments weren't worth holding on to. Ranger didn't seem affected either. Dogs lived in the moment, and maybe that was something the man admired most about him. After finishing his coffee, the man grabbed his jacket and whistled softly. Ranger perked up immediately. "You ready?" the man asked with a faint smile. Ranger's ears lifted and his tail swayed once, his version of a confident yes. Together, they set out toward the field as they always did. The air smelled fresh and earthy after a light rain the night before. Small puddles glimmered on the dirt path as they walked. The man liked mornings like this, quiet with the soft hum of nature and not much else. He felt at peace when the world slowed down like this. When they reached the field, he noticed a new sign near the edge, something about leash laws and pet safety. He smiled faintly, realizing it must have been added after the recent misunderstanding. He didn't mind. Rules kept people comfortable, and he understood that not everyone had lived the kind of life he had. He unclipped Ranger's leash and gave a short hand signal. Ranger moved instantly into position, ready to train. The man began their drills, short runs, recall commands, retrieval exercises. Ranger performed every task with smooth precision, his eyes locked on the man, waiting for the next cue. It was an ordinary session, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that hinted at what would unfold later that day. After training, they walked to the far edge of the field. Near the line of trees where the ground dipped slightly toward a small pond, the man knelt, picked up a stick, and threw it gently into the shallow water. Ranger splashed in, grabbed it, and returned with proud energy. The man laughed quietly. "Show off," he said. Ranger wagged his tail, water dripping from his coat. When they finally headed home, the man noticed a few people standing on the trail, watching from a distance. He waved politely and they waved back. He thought nothing of it. In a small town, people always notice things, but most of them meant no harm. Back at home, the day went by slowly. The man fixed the fence in the backyard, oiled the hinges on the porch door, and made a sandwich for lunch. Ranger lay under the shade tree, watching him calmly, occasionally lifting his head when a car passed. By late afternoon, the man decided to take Ranger into town for a quick errand. He needed to pick up dog food and a few supplies from the small store near the center of town. Ranger always rode quietly in the passenger seat, his head slightly out the window, enjoying the breeze. People smiled when they saw them, the man and his loyal dog always together. The store clerk greeted them warmly when they arrived. "Hey there! You and your partner out running errands again?" she said cheerfully. The man smiled. "Just stocking up. He eats better than I do," he joked. Ranger sat beside him, calm and obedient, not moving even as other customers passed by. A little boy pointed at him and said, "Wow, he looks like a superhero dog." The man chuckled. "He kind of is," he said softly. After paying, they got back into the truck and drove home. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow across the town. The man rolled down his window and let the fresh air in. It was the kind of peaceful drive that made him thankful for simple days. When they turned onto their street, though, he noticed something unusual. 2 police cars parked near the far end, just beyond his driveway. His first thought was that maybe there'd been an accident nearby. He slowed the truck, glancing toward the flashing lights. He parked and got out, still calm, as Ranger waited patiently inside the truck. The officers seemed to be talking to someone near the sidewalk, the same woman who had called before. She pointed in his direction. He could tell from her tone and body language that she was upset. He walked closer, keeping his voice polite. "Afternoon, officers," he said. "Everything all right?" The older officer turned, recognizing him immediately. "Afternoon, sir. We just had another call about your dog." The man raised his eyebrows slightly. "Again? He hasn't even been outside since this morning." The woman spoke up sharply. "He was loose earlier. He ran near my yard again. My dog's terrified. The man looked surprised. Ma'am, I think you're mistaken. He was with me the whole morning and I just came back from town. He's been on leash and in the truck the whole time. The officer held up a hand, trying to keep things calm. Let's just check things out, all right? Of course, the man said. He opened the truck door and Ranger hopped down gracefully, sitting beside him as soon as he landed. He's under control, the man added, keeping his voice even. But the woman backed away slightly, waving her hands. See, he's not on a leash. He could attack at any moment. The man sighed quietly. He won't, he's trained. Please don't shout, it only makes him alert. The officers exchanged uncertain looks. The younger one seemed tense, hand hovering near his side. The older one stepped forward slowly. Sir, would you mind putting the leash on him? Just for everyone's comfort. Sure thing, the man said, reaching calmly into his pocket. He moved slowly, not wanting Ranger to think something was wrong. He clipped the leash and gave a quiet command. Ranger stayed seated, perfectly still, but the woman was still speaking loudly, her words mixing with the sound of passing cars. The energy around them shifted, small but noticeable. Ranger's head turned slightly toward her voice. He wasn't being aggressive. He was just doing what he had always done, observing, assessing. The man gave a soft whistle. Focus, he said. Ranger's eyes returned to him immediately. Everything could have ended there peacefully. It should have, but sometimes even calm moments turn unpredictable. From down the street, another neighbor's dog suddenly barked loudly, a deep, echoing bark that startled everyone. The woman jumped back with a small scream, and in that instant of movement and noise, Ranger stood up quickly, reacting to the sound like he had been trained to do in the field, alert, protective, eyes scanning for the source. The younger officer misunderstood the reaction. He raised his voice slightly, stepping back. Sir, control your dog. I am, the man said firmly. He's fine. Just give him a second to, but panic spreads faster than reason. The woman's frightened tone, the tension in the air, the misread movements, all of it mixed into confusion. The man reached down, hand on Ranger's collar, giving a steady command to sit again. Ranger obeyed, lowering his body to the ground. But the damage was done. The younger officer looked unsure, his nerves visible. The older officer placed a hand on his shoulder, quietly saying something to calm him. The man tried to explain. Please, he's not a danger. He's a retired service dog. He reacts to noise because of his training, but he's disciplined. He won't hurt anyone. The woman shook her head, still afraid. You don't understand. He's dangerous. The man's heart sank. He had seen fear before. Real fear. The kind that made people see threats where there were none. He didn't blame her, but he wished she could see the truth. The officers asked him a few more questions, took notes, and eventually seemed to realize there was no real danger. The older one apologized for the trouble, assuring him they were just following up. It's all right, the man said quietly. You're just doing your job. The woman left, still muttering under her breath, but at least the tension faded. The man clipped Ranger's leash tighter and led him back toward the porch. Let's go home, buddy, he said softly. Inside, he sat down heavily on the couch. Ranger lay near his feet, his head resting gently on the man's boots. The house felt quiet again, but the peace had been shaken. The man leaned back, rubbing his face. You didn't do anything wrong, he whispered. You just did what you always do. He looked out the window, watching as the police cars drove away. His heart felt heavy. Not with anger, but with the weight of how easily good intentions could be misunderstood. He had always believed that calm and patience could fix most things, but he also knew how quickly fear could turn small problems into big ones. As the sun set that evening, the man took Ranger for a slow walk down the back trail, away from the neighborhood. The orange light of dusk painted the trees in warm shades. Ranger walked close to him, occasionally brushing against his leg. The man found comfort in that small contact, a reminder that no matter what happened, they still had each other. He stopped by the edge of the field where it all started, the same place where peace had once been so easy to find. The sky turned a deep pink, and the reflection shimmered across Ranger's eyes. The man placed a hand on his back and whispered, We'll be fine. Just need to stay quiet like always. Ranger looked up at him, calm, loyal, unwavering. The man smiled faintly. You're the best partner I ever had, he said. The wind rustled through the grass, and for a brief moment all the noise and misunderstanding of the day faded away. It was just them again, the soldier and his dog, standing side by side in the fading light, holding on to the peace they had built together, hoping the world would leave them in it a little longer. The next few days passed slowly, and the man tried to return to his quiet life again. He kept to his usual routine: morning coffee, training, long walks with Ranger. On the surface, everything looked peaceful, but something in him had changed. The calm that once felt natural now felt fragile, as if one wrong move could break it. The misunderstanding with the officers and the neighbor replayed in his mind more than he wanted it to. Not because he was angry, but because he was worried about how quickly good intentions could be turned into trouble. He had spent his life in places where communication meant survival. A single wrong word or movement back then could lead to chaos. And now, in a small, quiet town, he was beginning to realize the same truth still applied. Ranger, of course, didn't seem bothered. Dogs didn't dwell on the past the way people did. Every morning he was up and ready to train, tail wagging gently as if nothing had happened. The man admired that about him. It reminded him to keep moving forward one day at a time. That Saturday morning, the sky was overcast, gray clouds stretching far across the horizon. The man could smell rain in the air. He decided to take Ranger out early before the weather turned. He packed the usual: a ball, a whistle, some treats, and the folded flag that never left his backpack. The field was empty when they arrived. The wind was stronger than usual, rustling through the grass and bending the tops of the trees. It wasn't the best weather for training, but the man liked it that way. He preferred when the world was quiet, when no one else was around to misunderstand what they were doing. He unclipped Ranger's leash and gave a few short commands. The dog responded instantly, as always. They practiced search drills, retrieval cues, and obedience signals. Despite the wind, Ranger stayed sharp, his focus never breaking. The man couldn't help but smile as he watched him. "Still got it, huh?" he said softly. But as they trained, the sky darkened and thunder rolled faintly in the distance. He decided to end the session early. He whistled once, a signal for Ranger to return, and reached into his pack for the leash. That was when he noticed a car parked at the far edge of the road, just beyond the field. It wasn't unusual for people to park there sometimes: joggers, hikers, even families stopping to take photos of the open landscape. But this car didn't move, and the person inside seemed to be watching. The man squinted slightly, feeling the instinctive alertness that had never quite left him. He wasn't paranoid, just cautious. After a few moments, the car drove off. He let out a slow breath and looked down at Ranger, who was sitting calmly, waiting for his next cue. "Old habits," the man said to himself with a faint smile. "Always watching, right?" They headed home just as the rain began to fall. The drops grew heavier as they reached the porch, and by the time they were inside, both were damp but content. The man dried Ranger's coat with a towel and filled his bowl with fresh water. The sound of rain against the roof filled the house. It was steady, comforting. He spent most of the day reading, fixing small things around the house, and letting the storm pass. In the evening, as the sky cleared, he took Ranger out one last time before dark. The air smelled clean. The grass glistened under the fading light. Everything felt calm again. But early the next morning, that calm was broken. He woke up to a knock at his door, firm, but not aggressive. When he opened it, 2 uniformed officers stood outside. One of them he recognized from before. Their faces were serious but polite. "Morning, sir," the older one said. "Sorry to bother you again. Mind if we come in for a moment?" The man frowned slightly, confused but cooperative. "Of course. Come on in." They stepped inside, removing their hats out of respect. Ranger stood near the kitchen, watching quietly, his body language calm but alert. "What's going on?" the man asked. The officer sighed softly. "We just wanted to follow up on a few reports we've gotten from neighbors. Some people are still concerned about your dog. They say he looks threatening when you're out training." The man took a deep breath. "Threatening? He's just working drills. I make sure we're far from anyone else." "I understand that," the officer said. "We do, but you know how folks can be. Some of them get nervous seeing a big dog off leash, even if he's under control." The man nodded slowly. "I get it. People don't always understand what they see." The younger officer, who had been quiet, spoke up softly. Maybe just keep him leashed at all times in public, sir. It might ease everyone's worries." The man looked down at Ranger, who was lying calmly at his feet. The idea of keeping him leashed all the time stung a little. Not because it was a big rule to follow, but because it reminded him of how different things had become. Out there in the world he came from, this dog had been free to run, to search, to lead. Now he had to be contained so people wouldn't be afraid of him. Still, he smiled politely. "I understand. I'll do my best to follow that." The officers thanked him for his time and left soon after. As the man closed the door, he felt a wave of frustration that he quickly pushed aside. He didn't want anger to take root in his heart. It never led anywhere good. He knelt beside Ranger and rubbed his ears. "Guess we'll have to change our ways a little," he said softly. "Doesn't mean we stop training. We'll just find a better place, somewhere quieter." That evening he drove out to a more remote area, a clearing just outside the town near the woods. It was open and peaceful, far from houses and people. The kind of place where no one would misunderstand a dog doing his job. They trained there for an hour as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The golden light spread across the grass, warm and soft. The man felt calm again, like the world had given him a moment to breathe. But back in town, the situation was beginning to take on a life of its own. A few neighbors had posted online about a man with a military dog acting suspicious. They didn't mean harm, just concern. But in small towns, stories travel fast. Soon the post spread beyond the neighborhood group, and people began to comment, adding guesses and opinions. When the man went into town the next morning to buy groceries, he noticed a few people looking at him differently, not unkindly but cautiously. Whispers followed when he passed. He didn't react. He'd been through worse than gossip, but it hurt all the same. At home, he decided to stay out of sight for a few days. He worked on fixing his porch, repainting the old shed, anything to keep busy. Ranger stayed close, following him everywhere like a shadow. A week later, there was another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't the police. It was a man in plain clothes with a polite smile. He introduced himself as a reporter from a nearby town who had heard about the incident involving a former soldier and his dog. "I just wanted to hear your side of the story," the reporter said kindly. The man hesitated but finally invited him in. Over coffee, he spoke simply, no drama, no bitterness. He explained how Ranger was a retired service dog, how they trained quietly to keep skills sharp, how misunderstandings had turned into rumors. The reporter listened carefully, nodding. Before leaving, he said, "I think people will want to hear this. It's a good story, about loyalty, about how service doesn't end when the uniform comes off." The man didn't expect much, but a few days later the story appeared online. It was a short article, but it painted him and Ranger in a new light, as partners who had served their country and were now trying to live peacefully. The article spread quickly, and this time it brought something he hadn't expected: understanding. People began stopping by to thank him for his service. Letters appeared in his mailbox, small notes of support, people saying they were sorry for judging too soon. Even the woman who had been afraid came by one afternoon, nervously holding a small bag of dog treats. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't know he was a service dog. I was scared that day." The man smiled kindly. "It's all right," he said. "Fear makes people see things differently." "I understand." She nodded and looked at Ranger. "He really is beautiful," she said softly. After that, things began to change. The tension faded, replaced by a quiet respect. When the man and Ranger went out walking, people waved again. Kids asked to pet Ranger, and the man taught them how to approach a working dog the right way, calmly, gently, with respect. The local police department even invited him to give a small talk about service dogs and how to handle similar calls in the future. He agreed, not because he wanted recognition, but because he wanted understanding. On the day of the talk, he stood in front of a small group of officers and townspeople. Ranger sat beside him, calm as ever. The man spoke from the heart, about trust, discipline, and the bond between a soldier and his dog. He didn't talk about war or danger. He talked about love, loyalty, and peace. By the end, everyone was smiling. The room felt lighter, warmer. The man looked down at Ranger, who looked back up at him with those deep, steady eyes that had seen everything. Driving home that evening, the sky was clear and full of stars. The man rolled down the window, letting the cool night air in. Ranger sat beside him, head resting near the open window. For the first time in a long while, the man felt something deep and full, a sense that maybe the world wasn't so divided after all. "Looks like we're final,"